Understanding what it means for a source to be empirical or non-empirical and primary or secondary is an important starting point. But what really matters is whether you can determine how a particular source will be categorized. That's what you need to be able to do when you're practicing savvy skepticism. This activity will walk you through some examples and what we can look for to do that. Okay, before I explain whether this is empirical or not and how we know, pause this recording and read the abstract in this slide. Then decide if you think it's empirical or not, and resume the recording to learn more. If you're reading the transcript, do the same thing before you move on. What did you decide? If you said it's empirical, you're right. One direct signal that a source is empirical is when the abstract refers to a study or multiple studies, the results, and participants, like this one does. I underline the phrase that's the clearest signal. The authors also refer to our studies in the last sentence, which confirms that it's accurate to categorize this as an empirical source. Remember I said that we can usually classify the entire source as being empirical or not, but the information within that source can be non-empirical and secondary. This is the third paragraph of the same article we looked at in the last slide. Before you move on to the next slide, skim this paragraph and decide if you think it's primary source information or secondary. If you said secondary, you're correct. How do we know? Because the primary sources are identified at the end of the sentences. This publication uses APA style, and the information about the authors and the year of publication is called a citation. Other styles use footnotes or another form of notes. Regardless of the style, if another author is given credit for an idea, then the information you're looking at is considered a secondary source. This is another section of the same article. Is this section primary or secondary? Pause to skim the text and make a note to yourself about what it is and why before you move on. The fact that the heading included the word results might have helped you decide this is primary source information. And this part is primary source information. There aren't citations, which is one signal that it may be primary source information. Another cue is that the authors write in the first person, suggesting they're telling the reader about something they did. The actual content also fits with the idea of primary source information because it is clearly the results of the study. Notice, though, that I said this part is primary source information. This article combines the results and discussion in one section. In many APA-style papers, they're separate sections. The discussion section often includes secondary source information, and, fitting with that, the last part of the same paragraph includes secondary source information. Here's another example. Please pause to skim the abstract and decide if the article is empirical or non-empirical. The first couple of sentences make it seem like it might be a review of other findings, which would be non-empirical. They even use the word reviews. Did that trip you up? If we keep reading, the text changes to the first person and talks about integrating data, which can be part of the method for a study. When that's combined with the phrase, our findings, we can be comfortable thinking the source is empirical. In this case, the title also helps us know that the study is empirical because it indicates the source reports on a meta-analysis, which is a type of research design. We'll learn more about that in other types of designs in another module. Did you say this was empirical? If not, make sure you know what confused you and if my explanation helped you avoid that confusion in the future. Okay, now let's think again about primary and secondary types of information. Pause to skim this paragraph and make notes about which you think it is and why. This article also uses APA style, which helps us know that this paragraph is secondary source information because the citations are also visible. It's probably important for me to mention that the citations aren't always in a different color and underlined like they are in these slides. I'm using examples to help you get more familiar with what to look for, so when they blend in with the text, you know to look for them. Here's another paragraph from that article. Pause again to skim and think before moving on. The results heading might have made you think this is probably primary source information, and it is. In this case, the section starts by explaining the specific information that will be found in the following paragraphs. Unlike the last example, this article also separates the discussion into a separate section. This is the abstract of a different article. Go ahead and pause, skim, and decide if it's empirical or non-empirical before you move on. This example is a little different. It's for a non-empirical source. The abstract includes a couple of signals that the source is non-empirical. I underlined 2 of them. The phrase, "we attempt to integrate current knowledge," indicates that this is a review, as does the author's use of the word describing in that sentence. Another way to look for clues that a source is non-empirical is by thinking what isn't included instead of what is. Notice that this abstract doesn't refer to a study or use the words participants or findings. The last sentence could be a little tricky because the authors refer to empirical tests, but they talk about summarizing tests, which signals that they're talking about the tests more generally rather than reporting on the results of tests. The fact that that's in the last sentence also helps us know it probably doesn't mean it's an empirical source, because they'd probably need to say more about the study if it was empirical, and that means it wouldn't be in the last sentence. This is a paragraph from the same article. Remember that it's a non-empirical article, but non-empirical articles can include primary source information, so we still need to think about that when we're reading. Pause this paragraph to skim and decide if you think it's primary source information or secondary. As with the other articles, this includes numerous sentences based on other sources, and the citations for those sources signal that this is a secondary source for the information. This is another section from the same article. Pause again to skim and decide whether you think this is primary or secondary source information. Since this is a non-empirical article, it doesn't include the same sections of an empirical article where we know we can find primary source information. And there might not be any primary source information to be found. In this case, though, there is. If you said this was primary source information, you are correct. Like in the other articles, the authors use the first person to signal that might be the case. The absence of citations also indicates it's not secondary source information. When we read the section of the article, we also learn that they're suggesting a classification system with 3 parts. Combining that with the other cues makes me pretty confident this is primary source information. Okay, one more example. Pause to skim and think one more time. Did you decide this is non-empirical? If so, you are correct. The authors of the study started signaling it's non-empirical by using the word "a review" in the title. The phrase I underlined in the abstract itself also suggests that the article is non-empirical, and the authors don't refer to a study or conducting analysis, so we can be pretty confident this source is not empirical. The last sentence suggests there might be some primary source information in the article. As you might expect, though, the large majority of the article is a secondary source. So much so that I couldn't pull a good example of primary source information. Sometimes we do need to look at the full article or presentation materials to decide if a source is empirical or not. But I found that the title and the abstract usually provide enough information, so looking for the keywords and the way the summary is written can make it relatively easy to identify an empirical source. When we're thinking about how to use the information within the source, we need to think about what's primary and what's secondary. Sometimes the headings help. We'll learn more about the different formats of sources in another module. But for now, we can look for a results section to find primary source information. We can also look for sentences written in the first person. At the same time, we need to watch for information that indicates the authors are giving credit to someone else, which would suggest it's secondary source.